Bible and the fall of mankind, it all centers around this concept. You see, what they really wanted was to sit where only God could sit. Now, I've shared this story with you before. In our house, there was a chair that was my dad's chair. Nobody sat in my dad's chair. And you just learned very early on, life was better for you if you stayed in your seat and out of dad's seat. And life got complicated if you challenged that. Well, I think that's what happened in Eden. Satan looks down at Adam and Eve and says, why don't you sit where God's sitting? They say, well, that's God's chair. He says, well, why don't you take his chair? And I've just summarized the fall of creation right there. It's wanting to sit in the place that doesn't belong to us. And Joseph shows up, and he shows us that even with all those bad intentions, what God intended, remember, that's from the Hebrew word to weave. God has weaved together a better story. Now, this wanting to sit in a seat that's not ours is the very reason in this world we can't just get along. This self-centeredness, this worship of self is why in a world of almost 7 billion people, we all want to sit in the top seat, in the top throne. This is where violence, hatred, anger, frustration, and struggles come from. And with all these individual wills constantly crashing into each other, there can be no peace. But God, Joseph will say, is weaving together a different story. And through Joseph, he shows us this key to hanging on when everything goes wrong. And the key is, you let go of those things you don't need to be holding on to. And it looks like this. Joseph let go of the lie that he was in charge or should be. He let go of the lie that he was in control of things that were beyond his control. He didn't live this irritated life because no one and no thing was going the way he wanted it to. Joseph let go of that inherited idea that it's all about me. And I'll tell you, he didn't come up with that on his own. From the first words of the first book that God has recorded, he said it. In the beginning, God created. Joseph always knew this is God's story. And he can put people and characters where he wants to. I'll just play the role he wants. I don't want a different role. I don't demand a rewrite. God, it's your story. Show me how you'll use me. And so when we last left Joseph, he was in jail in Egypt. And had nothing to hold on to but faith and a dream. And so let's take a look at that. If you want to look at Genesis 41. Joseph finds out pretty quickly he's not the only dreamer in God's story. Even the Pharaoh had dreams. And so we start at verse 1. It says, when 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream, and he was standing by the Nile. And the short of the dream is this. There were 7 really big and strong, healthy cows. All of a sudden, they're eaten by 7 very scrawny cows, which would be a disturbing dream. Only when the scrawny cows ate, they didn't get bigger. And the same thing happens with wheat. And it bothers the Pharaoh. And in verse 8, it says, in the morning, his mind was troubled. And so he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt, and Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. Now, I was thinking about this, and I remembered the sign we had behind my seat, actually, in the kitchen. I sat on the little bench around the table, and the sign directly behind my head was, if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. Now, clearly you get the wisdom of that instruction, right? Imagine a Pharaoh. If this dictator's not happy, there's nobody that's going to be happy, and he is troubled. And there's a little bit of politics playing here. Because like Nebuchadnezzar, he can't get anybody whose job it is to interpret dreams to tell him what his dream means. And here's why. People at that level have people that give them the news they want to hear. And nobody wants to bring bad news to a guy with this much power. You'd hate to be the one that made a bad day for him. And so a little bit of that's going on as well, but there's no interpretation for them. And he's troubled. Because he begins to sense, and I love this, the Pharaoh who would call himself God begins to sense, I think there's a higher power that's trying to tell me something. And so look at chapter 41, verses 9 through 14, and we see a battle of gods beginning. It says, then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, today I'm reminded of my shortcomings. So I'll just remind you, it's been 2 years since he's been reminded of his shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and his chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream that same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was hanged. And so Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. And when he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Like, this is the moment, right? Imagine the emotions coming over Joseph, long forgotten by his family, his boss, and the guy he helped in prison. And he's shaved, and he's cleaned up, and he's standing before Pharaoh, and he has to be thinking, this is my big shot. And if it were us, that's probably what we'd be thinking. But Joseph's not thinking about himself. He's not a self-promoter in that way. He's living to promote and exalt God. Go on in verse 15. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that you hear a dream and you can interpret it. Listen to Joseph. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, this is my dream. And again, in short, by the Nile, 7 fat cows were grazing. 7 scrawny cows ate them, but the skinny didn't get any stronger. And I saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, swallowed up by 7 withered heads. None of the magicians could explain it to me. Verse 25, then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh, God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance and coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. Well, Joseph didn't hold back. He gives the dream as God would interpret it. And I want you to understand that in a land that's just held together by agriculture, famine is not a word you throw around. There was no wise men throwing this word around to Pharaoh. This is a scary thing. But what makes it less scary in Egypt is Egypt has the Nile. I mean, the Nile is the Nile. The Nile's never gone anywhere. It's supported by rainforests in Central Africa. The Nile is dependable. The Nile always flows. And if you catch my drift here, that is the sound of denial right there. Brian, that was largely for you. This Hebrew convict, I don't know why, but I always pictured him in an orange jumpsuit here, but he's been changed and washed and shaved. Stands before Pharaoh and says, God says this is coming. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. Now, I just want you all to grasp for a moment what a big deal that statement is. The nameplate above Pharaoh's throne, and I just assume there's a nameplate. It doesn't just say king, it says God. Here's a man from birth who's born God to his people. He's to be worshiped by his people. And here this ex-convict stands before him, a foreigner at that, and says, Pharaoh, my God is telling you what's going on, and my God is the God. He sits on the throne, rules over the whole world, and yes, that includes Egypt. And my God has ordered and revealed the future of Egypt, and you can't do anything to stop it. Now, I just want to say, that is some real courage. I mean, if the guy's just looking to get out of jail, this is not necessarily the way to go about it. But Joseph, no matter what the cost, no matter how long he was forgotten, was going to hang on to God. I love the story of King Louis XIV of France. Not a lot of great stories about him, but this one is actually his burial day. After a long rule, a tyrant at best, he's known for calling himself the Great, or Sun God is the way that's usually interpreted. Is also famous for saying, I am the state. There's a good ruler for you. Made provisions at his burial that he would have a big service. Everybody would be kind of invited in, but it was supposed to be dimly lit with just one candle, golden candle over his golden coffin to signify how great his light was. Well, as the service began, the then Bishop Maslin began to speak, and slowly reaching down, he snuffed out the candle and said, only God is great. Now I want to note that he did that while the king was dead. Joseph is looking Pharaoh in the eyes, having just come out of his personal dungeon. And looking this God king in the eyes, he says, look, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has just determined the next 14 years of your reign, and you'd better do something about it. And Joseph's on a roll. In fact, he not only points to the problem, he now tells Pharaoh, this is what you ought to do. And so keep reading in verse 33. And now let Pharaoh, I just love it, he's giving advice. Let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land and take a fifth of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of good years that are coming and store them, the grain under authority of Pharaoh, to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country, to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, and so that country may not be ruined by the famine. And the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. I just want to point out here, Joseph gives Pharaoh the plan, but he doesn't promote himself as the man. And the plan's like he's got a perfect plan. But where's Joseph's name in this? Do you notice that? Joseph never elevates himself. He just keeps focusing on the role God's asked him to play. You notice again that conversation he had with Pharaoh. God will tell you your dream. God has revealed your future to you. God has shown you these things. God has decided. God will do it soon. You see, Joseph never lost sight that God is the star of this story. And he's here to play whatever role God would have him play. Joseph wasn't trying to take God's seat. And he gave Pharaoh a whole lot to think about. In fact, this is just real good wisdom here. You hear this in Proverbs 3:34. God mocks the proud mockers, but he gives grace to the humble. Joseph steps into that humble category. And Peter would add to that, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he might lift you up in due time. See, God will lift up those who take advantage of the opportunity to lift him up. And Joseph is exactly that. In fact, I'm going to go back to chapter 41. Look at verse 38. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man in whom is the Spirit of God? That's the point, folks. Will you go through everything Joseph went through? Family rejection, betrayal at work, being forgotten by friends. Will you endure everything Joseph endured if the end result is only to be seen as someone who bears the mark of God's Spirit? And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. And listen, this is especially true to those who are in the pit right now. There's no telling what difference a day can make. Joseph woke up that morning in a dungeon. Scraggly beard, dirty clothes. And by the time he goes to bed that night, he's in a palace of his own. Second most powerful man in the world. And I just want to point out, we love the rags to riches part of the story. That's not the point. The point is what he held on to and what he was willing to let go of. Joseph had that figured out. It's the character of the man we see here. From what I've seen in my life, it is hard to remain spiritually balanced when you move instantly from pit to palace. I know I've been here now. I was just talking to someone, this summer will be 7 years I've been your preacher here, and what I'm about to say might be the most radical statement I've ever made from this pulpit. And it's this. Adversity is hard on people, but prosperity is harder. That's the way I've seen it. And maybe your experience is different, but in my own experience, I can't think of one person that I've known and asked, what was it that drove you closer to God? What was it that made your relationship sure? What was it that brought you in close without an answer of some kind of adversity, some kind of trial? And I have watched prosperity just ravage God's people. And so what's Joseph going to do? He's 30 years old. He gets the job of his dreams. All the power you could have ever hoped for. New clothes, new jewelry. He's got the finest gold chariot gold could buy. And he's got a wife. He's got just enough earthly goods to really mess with his spiritual equilibrium. And what I love about Joseph's account is Pharaoh has to be looking at this and realize, I can heap honor upon honor upon honor on the son of Jacob, but I can't get rid of Jacob's faith in his son. He kept hanging on to God, good and bad. In fact, I want to show you this attitude in verses 50 through 52. It says, before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by his wife. And Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, it's because God has made me forget all my trouble on my father's household. And the second son he named Ephraim and said, it's because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. I mean, just think about this. Pharaoh gave Joseph an Egyptian name. And he gave Joseph an Egyptian wife, who of course had an Egyptian name. And Joseph has 2 sons, and he gives them Hebrew names. Every time he says those boys' names, he's calling out the authority, the sovereignty of the God of Israel. And look at their names. Ephraim, I look at you, and I'm reminded of what God has done. We're fruitful here. We've been provided for. I didn't do this. It wasn't my wisdom. God has done it. And Manasseh, I've been through some horrible times in my life, but I don't carry those with me. God has caused me to forget. He's removed them from me. Now, that being said, God didn't want Joseph to forget the dream. And if you remember the beginning of his story, the dream was that his family would bow down to him. Now, think of where we're at in the text. Joseph is free. He's the second most powerful man in the world. He can do whatever he wants, and yet 9 years go by and Joseph doesn't go home. Did you ever think about that? You see, I think Joseph started to figure the best way to deal with the pain of my past is to just bury it and stay away from it. But God wants to demonstrate to Joseph that that's not the way God has us deal with those things. God wants to restore relationships. God's got a broader picture, a bigger plan here. And so Joseph learns that if you're not willing to go home to family, God will bring the family to Egypt to see you. And he's going to have to face what for many years he's dreaded. And so the famine causes Jacob to send his boys to Egypt. That's where the food was. And we'll cover this reunion later. Just don't have time to do it today. But just notice in that story, all the brothers are there and they're bowing down to the second in command of Egypt. The dream is realized. And if you know how stories work, if you are a fan of the Count of Monte Cristo or maybe even Zorro, you get what should come next. Joseph's about to get even. He's got power. He can make them pay. These men will finally get what they deserve. But what we see instead is that God has developed Joseph to let go of that kind of thinking and to restore instead of getting even. And so look at chapter 45 if you want to jump ahead in the first 8 verses there. And then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." And so there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. And then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God." Skip down to verse 12. "You can see for yourselves, and so, my brother Benjamin, that it is really I who am speaking to you. Tell my father about all the honor accorded me in Egypt and about everything you have seen, and bring my father down quickly." And then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept, and Benjamin embraced him weeping. And I think verse 15 is probably the most important. "And he kissed all his brothers, and he wept over them." Think of all he's letting go of because he wants to hold on to the relationship God has given. Joseph let go of focusing on self, and he focused on hanging on to God, and he was blessed by this. Notice the ways he tells his brothers this story. 2 times he says, "God sent me ahead of you." It wasn't your plan that got me here. God had a plan. In fact, he adds, it was not you who sent me, but God. You see, Joseph refused to look back on his past and focus on the pain. Instead, he looked for providence. He could see what God was building in his life. He could see what God was preparing. And just put it to you this way. If you want to hold on to all the bitterness of your past, you will forfeit, you will let go of all the betterness God has for you. You can't have both. You got to let go and hang on. I'll say this, there's something just so liberating when we let go of the need to elevate ourselves, promote ourselves. It's so freeing when we let go of the need to vindicate ourselves or get even with others. And when we just remember, the throne belongs to God. That's not my seat. I'm going to stay over here and wait for orders from the throne. And if you're waiting, orders have come. Paul says it this way in Romans 12. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. I want to say, this is some of the most powerful texts in the New Testament. It is completely counterintuitive to the human being. We're not good at it, and we don't practice it enough. When someone does something evil to you, when someone hurts you or curses you, you know what to do intuitively, but that doesn't come from the throne of God. And so Paul reminds you, you don't repay evil to anyone. If it's possible, as far as depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Don't take revenge, my friends, but leave room for the wrath of God. Do not be overcome with evil. But Christians, this is the calling card of who we are in Christ. Overcome evil with good. Joseph figured this out. He was able to hold on. And I would just say this is a tough balance, isn't it? Holding on to God by letting go of all the right things. But it starts by making God the center of everything and not self, by remembering who's on the throne and wasting no time trying to vindicate ourselves. You see, God is in the restore and repair business, which as co-workers with God makes it our business to forgive, to really promote that healing. You may not know these pictures here. Those are pictures of Joseph Parker and Charles Spurgeon. They were the most well-known preachers in England in the 1800s. The story is, at one point, Parker had made a comment that, we really ought to help out Spurgeon with his orphanage. Spurgeon had put a whole lot into helping these boys of London who were really distressed, took pride in this work. And he said, we ought to help them out. They need good clothes, and I'm sure they could use a good meal. Well, somebody overheard him say that and went back to Charles Spurgeon and says, hey, Parker is just running your orphanage down. He's all over you. He doesn't think you're doing a great work, like people do, right? Spun it. Well, the interesting thing about this day and age is there were 2 news reporters at every service, and they took down every word of Spurgeon's lessons. It was in the paper the next day. And so they were there the day that Spurgeon responded to what he thought was a slight, and he just laid into Parker. And so, of course, the next week came, and they wanted to know, how's Parker going to respond? Well, he got up into the pulpit and made the announcement that today, so happens, Charles Spurgeon is sick and cannot preach. And this is usually the day they set aside to take up a collection for the orphanage. He said, I thought it would be a good idea if our church did that today. It's a good work, and we'd all like to be a part of it. And they passed the plate 3 times that day and got back to Spurgeon with what had been collected. And Charles showed up at Parker's door, his study door, and threw his arms around him and said to his friend, you have practiced grace on me. You've given me not what I deserve, but what I needed. And I just want you to understand, that's what living the Christian life should look like. When God's on the throne and we're not, when God's in charge and it's not about us and what we want, this is what it looks like. And it's not an easy way to live. It's not. In fact, I don't think it's possible without the Spirit's help. And so pray in the Spirit for God to help you live this way. Joseph never forgot that this is God's story, and he was willing to be whatever part God wanted him to be. And so by the end of his life, we see him say this to his brothers. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. When you feel there's no way out, when you feel trapped, when you feel the need for revenge, the need to get even, when you find yourself moving closer to a throne that's not yours, stop and think, God is sitting there. And he's got a bigger plan. Even with all of this, he can weave it together for good. Lift up God, and He will lift you up. Notice, lift up God and He will lift you up at the right time. That's not your time. That's not when you want it. That's not when you schedule it. In God's good time, He will lift you up. Trust God with the people that hurt you. And make sure you change seats. Get off the throne. That's God's seat. And remember who's in charge. We're going to look more into Joseph's life in 2 weeks. That'll be Father's Day. We're going to look at the faith of Jacob there. But think about the life of this faithful young man and how by hanging on to God and letting go of what held him back, he really was able to be all that God wanted him to be. If you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, we extend the opportunity for you to put on Christ in baptism. If that's your need or you want to study about that, let us know. You can be buried with Christ, your sins washed away. If you're here and you need our prayers, again, we don't want to ever leave here without you having the opportunity to pray with those who love you and love God. If we can help you, you can let us know. And we're going to stand and sing a final song of encouragement. Let's stand and sing out.
Jesus calls.